In the second lecture for Module 11, we're going to take a look at the emergence of a mass movement against Jim Crow segregation. We'll focus on judicial developments from 1950 to 1953, developments that will, of course, lead to the Brown versus Board of Education decision. Then we'll look at what's going on in terms of the civil rights movement or civil rights developments from 1955 to 1960. And then finally, at the legislative action in the aftermath of the Brown decision. What I want you to focus on in this module, both in the first lecture and in this lecture, is how these three branches of government, judiciary, legislature, and executive, are responding to demands for change in the second half of the 20th century. In the second half of the 20th century, so far what we've focused on is the impact of World War II in terms of blacks serving in the military units in World War II, and in Europe and in the Pacific, the involvement of black soldiers in these efforts, people like the Tuskegee Airmen. On the home front, the Double V campaign, victory at home as well as victory in the Pacific, and the victory in the war as a whole. So this Double V campaign, blacks in a sense are saying that they're not going to be satisfied with just a victory over foreign forces. They want to bring about change, and they want to bring democracy into America as a whole. Executive orders, both during the war and in the aftermath of the war, are changing gradually the military and the home front and the defense industries. All of these are emerging. You also have societal changes that are taking place, gradually bringing desegregation or integration into different levels of American life. Just the simple thing, or the not so simple in the 1940s, but this development in which you have the first African American playing in the major leagues in baseball, the all-American sport, the executive branch of government again, those orders finally in the aftermath of World War II desegregating the military, the judicial decisions that we've looked at from 1905 until 1950, we discussed in the previous lecture. So what's new from the 1950s on in terms of the civil rights movement? Well, what is new? What we're going to see is the increasing importance of grassroots activism, not so much top-down orders that are coming from the executive branch or that the court is trying to enforce, or that the laws that the government, the local, state, or national government are handing down that will bring about an end to segregation. What we're looking at, and what's new from the 50s on, is that the movement will come from the bottom up. The pressure will come from the bottom up in the form of activism and protest in what we have traditionally described as this classic civil rights movement, a classic civil rights period. Although from what we've seen so far, we can actually trace this civil rights period all the way back to the first half, or throughout the 20th century. In terms of judicial developments from 1950 to 1953, the developments that will lead, in effect, to the Brown decision. In 1950, you have Briggs v. Elliott. The Supreme Court says, the courts are taking this first legal challenge to elementary school segregation in the South. This case will eventually be folded into the Brown versus the Board of Education case. Then you have the case of Henderson v. U.S. in 1950, where the Supreme Court orders the desegregation of dining cars on interstate railroads. Then in 1953, the Supreme Court upheld an 1872 statute opening District of Columbia restaurants to, quote, all well-behaved persons. One of the key figures in the protest leading up to this decision was Mary Church Terrell, who was a very old woman by this time, but who was still actively protesting and picketing against restaurants in Washington which refused to serve African Americans. And again, the court's decision in 1953 says that these restaurants have to serve all well-behaved persons. Mary Church Terrell had been fighting since the late 19th century against Jim Crow segregation. And this decision in 1953 was probably the last great activist effort on the part of Mary Church Terrell. She died soon after that. At the beginning of chapter 17, they talk about the grassroots activism of a young student by the name of Barbara Johns as she leads a student strike in Farmville, Virginia. I'd like for you to make sure that you go back and read this again and concentrate on her efforts and try to get an idea of what exactly do we mean by grassroots activism. In 1954, the Supreme Court hands down the Brown versus the Board of Education decision. This Brown decision is not just simply the case of Linda Brown in Topeka, Kansas. It's actually a case of, or the Brown case is actually several school desegregation cases that are folded or joined into this one decision. The decision of the courts at that time is that separate educational facilities are inherently unequal, and the court in effect overturns the Plessy versus Ferguson decision from 1894. The court had taken this case in 1952, and it had moved very slowly through the courts, but it is handed down in 1954. The players in the case, the key figures, are, of course, Chief Justice Earl Warren, recently added to the court as Chief Justice, the NAACP lawyers, Thurgood Marshall and James Nabert, historians, sociologists, and other scholars who argue or who lend their support and their background, their writings to support this case against segregation in schools. In 1955, the court hands down what has often been described as Brown 2, which addresses this question of how soon does desegregation have to occur. And the court says, with all deliberate speed, which in effect means probably nothing, because all deliberate speed really means whenever the individual school systems across the country can move in that direction. Now, the responses, on the other hand, to the Brown decision were violent in many cases. There is resistance on the part of the newly developed anti-Black groups like the Citizens Councils. By 1955, they're organized in 1955, and by 1956, these Citizens Councils have over 250,000 members. The Citizens Councils adopted a policy of what they described as state interposition, the idea that the state had an obligation to stand between the citizen and the federal government, that this was something that states have a right to do. So again, this is very simply a states' rights response. They also called for massive resistance to the Brown decision. In 1956, however, or 1956 rather, 101 members of Congress, 90 representatives, and all of the Southern senators, except for the two senators from Tennessee, Estes Kefauver and Albert Gore Sr., and the senator from Texas, Lyndon B. Johnson, all of the senators and 101 members of Congress signed the Southern Manifesto, which was an agreement opposing the Supreme Court's authority to desegregate the schools. In the manifesto, they denied the Supreme Court had a right to rule on racial issues in public schools. There are legal attacks on NAACP offices in several states and increased violence. And in this period, this early civil rights period, in the aftermath of the Brown decision, there are several developments that are critical. In 1955, you have the murder of Emmett Till, again, right after the Brown decision. And this particular murder of this young Black boy from Chicago, who's just visiting relatives in Mississippi, seemed to just grab the nation's attention, especially in the way that it was reported in black magazines like Jet and in newspapers like the Chicago Defender and the Tri-State Defender, all across the country and across the world. The people seemed to were able to focus on this horrible incident of racial murder in the South. And you have, on the part of many students, when many people are asked what actually motivated them to become a part of the civil rights movement, many young people who were active in the sit-ins of the 1950s, in the 1960s, and the different degrees of civil rights activism that we're going to talk about in the next lectures, many of them pointed to the murder of Emmett Till as the event that radicalized them and moved them to become a part of the civil rights movement. In the 1950s, this grassroots civil rights movement that is emerging concentrates on integration of schools and desegregation of buses and restaurants or lunch counters. You have in 1955 the Montgomery bus boycott. The description, I'd like for you to review that information on pages 434 to 438. I'm not going to go into great detail describing this because this is one event that I think everybody is pretty familiar with, but I'd like for you to review the information in your textbook. In the aftermath of the Montgomery bus boycott, you have the organization of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in January of 1957. And of course, this is the group that Martin Luther King would lead from 1957 until his assassination in 1968. Then you have the desegregation of Little Rock Central High School in 1957, on pages 440 to 443, and the beginnings of the student sit-ins at the end of this chapter. So you have this movement that's kind of coming from the bottom up. It's being dictated, for the most part, by people from the bottom up. And when we look at, in this last segment, in the student sit-ins, what we'll even see is that here you have a student organization, that begin their challenges to segregation in the lunch counters, then come together, students from Nashville, students from Greensboro, North Carolina, they come together and they organize a student group, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, with the help of some older activists like Ella Baker. And Ella Baker, when she comes into the movement, when she goes to the student conference in Raleigh, North Carolina, she cautions the students and she tells them, you need to have your own organization and not one that will be subject to the dictates of your elders, in a sense. The elders, of course, being the Southern Christian Leadership Conference. Ella Baker had worked for the SCLC. She had also worked for the NAACP. She was a long-term activist, with her work dating back to the 1930s and 1940s. But she felt that the students needed to develop a system of what she called participatory democracy, one in which they would go into communities and find out what did the community think needed to be done. And we'll see this kind of activism put into effect in the next chapter as we look at the civil rights movement in the 1960s in Mississippi, in Alabama, in Georgia. In the late 1950s, the legislature, Congress, begins to move into civil rights activism with the passage of two civil rights acts. The first of these is the Civil Rights Act of 1957, which was the first civil rights legislation since the Civil Rights Act of 1875. You remember the 1875 Civil Rights Act had been the most sweeping civil rights legislation of the 19th century, but was very quickly overturned by the Supreme Court in those cases in 1883 and then in Plessy versus Ferguson. In 1957, the Civil Rights Act that passes then elevates the civil rights section of the Justice Department to a division under an assistant attorney general. appoints a commission on civil rights to investigate voting discrimination. So from this act, you can see that, or from that particular statement, it begins to become apparent that this whole issue, or the main focus of this act, is discrimination in voting. It made it a federal offense to interfere with the right to vote and authorized the Attorney General to prosecute voting rights cases. In 1960, Congress passes another Civil Rights Act, again focusing on voting rights. It required state officials to keep records of federal elections for 2 years. It strengthened the hand of the federal judges in voting cases, established criminal penalties for those who obstructed federal court orders or crossed state lines to engage in bombings or arson. So the first two provisions of this act deal with the voting rights. And then the third deals with the responses of people who were opposed to the breakdown of segregation, the violence. The court is trying to address this violence, whether it's in terms of voting rights or whether it's in terms of segregation, trying to address it and trying to say, we're going to bring in the authority of the federal government to try to control the violence of the period. So as we enter the 1960s, we see that the groundwork has been laid for a different kind of activism, a kind of activism that comes from the people themselves rather than from organizations like the NAACP, SCLC. It's an activism that wants to bring about change, not just simply by waiting for the courts to do something or waiting for Congress to pass a law. Now, that doesn't mean that these other elements are out of the picture. There will be civil rights legislation in the 1960s, like the 1964 Civil Rights Act, the 1965 Voting Rights Act. There will be court decisions all throughout the 1960s. There will be presidential action throughout the 1960s. There will be activism on the part of organizations like the NAACP and SCLC and CORE and SNCC and all of these groups. But the most important thing is just to see people themselves doing something, black and white, doing something to bring about change.